What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a routine talk show appearance, only to find himself facing a host who seems determined to make him uncomfortable? Tonight, we're diving into the shocking confrontation between Cillian Murphy and Jimmy Kimmel that ended with the Peaky Blinders star being escorted off the set. This isn't your typical celebrity interview gone wrong. This is something much deeper, much more personal, and frankly, much more disturbing. We're talking about a complete breakdown of professional courtesy, a host who lost all sense of boundaries, and an actor who refused to be anyone's punching bag. Before we get into the nitty-gritty details of what really went down that night, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, letting me know what you think about celebrities standing up for themselves when hosts cross the line. Because what you're about to hear will change how you look at late-night television forever. The stage was set like any other night at the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio in Hollywood. The familiar blue and orange backdrop gleamed under the studio lights. The audience was buzzing with their usual pre-show excitement, and the cameras were positioned perfectly to capture what everyone expected would be another standard celebrity interview. The production crew moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting lighting and checking sound levels, while audience members chatted among themselves about their excitement to see the enigmatic Irish actor in person. This was supposed to be a routine, promotional appearance, the kind that actors do dozens of times when they have a new project to promote. Nothing about the setup suggested that viewers were about to witness one of the most uncomfortable and explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Cillian Murphy walked out onto that stage to what seemed like genuine enthusiasm from the crowd. The audience erupted in applause as he made his way across the polished floor, waving briefly before taking his seat in the guest chair. He was impeccably dressed, as always, in a perfectly tailored dark suit that spoke to his understated but sophisticated sense of style. His trademark intensity was there, but softened by what appeared to be genuine appreciation for the warm welcome he'd received. Murphy had flown in from Ireland specifically for this appearance, part of a carefully planned media tour to promote his latest film project, something he'd been passionate about for years and had spent months preparing for. The Irish actor, known worldwide for his transformative performances in everything from Batman Begins to Peaky Blinders, had agreed to this appearance despite his well-documented preference for staying out of the Hollywood spotlight when not actively promoting his work. Those who know Murphy's career understand that he's never been one for the celebrity circus. He doesn't attend award shows unless nominated, rarely appears at Hollywood parties, and generally keeps his personal life completely separate from his professional work. His interviews are typically thoughtful, substantive affairs where he discusses his craft with the kind of intelligence and depth that reminds you why he's considered one of the finest actors of his generation. He takes his work seriously, prepares meticulously for every role, and treats each promotional appearance as an opportunity to share something meaningful about the creative process. This respect for the work, for the audience, and for the medium itself is what makes him such a compelling interview subject when he's paired with hosts who understand how to have a real conversation. Jimmy Kimmel welcomed Murphy to the show with what appeared to be standard host enthusiasm. The band played their usual flourish, Kimmel delivered his opening pleasantries, and for those first few moments, everything seemed perfectly normal. But if you watched closely, and we did, going back through the footage multiple times to catch every nuance, there was something different in Kimmel's demeanor from the very beginning. His smile seemed more forced than usual, more performative than genuine. His jokes felt more pointed, more aggressive, like someone who had already decided that his guest was going to be the target rather than the subject of the conversation. There was an underlying tension that anyone paying attention could feel building in the room, a sense that something was off about the host's energy before Murphy had even settled into his chair. The interview started innocently enough, with Kimmel asking about Murphy's latest project and his experience working with the acclaimed director who had directed the film. These were exactly the kinds of questions Murphy had prepared for, the standard promotional territory that every actor navigates during these media tours. Murphy began discussing the creative process behind the film, explaining what had drawn him to this particular role and how he'd approached bringing this complex character to life. He spoke with genuine passion about the months of preparation he'd undertaken, the extensive research he'd done into the character's background and psychological makeup, the physical transformation he'd undergone, and the emotional investment he'd made in understanding every aspect of this person he was portraying on screen. It was the kind of substantive conversation that viewers tune in for, the kind that gives real insight into an actor's craft and helps audiences understand the dedication and artistry that goes into creating memorable performances. Murphy discussed working with his fellow cast members, the collaborative relationship he'd developed with the director, and the unique challenges this particular role had presented. He was engaging, informative, and genuinely interesting to listen to, sharing anecdotes about the filming process and the creative decisions that had shaped his performance. For those first 10 minutes, it seemed like the interview was going to be exactly what it should have been: a professional, respectful conversation between a host and a guest who had something meaningful to share. But then something shifted in Kimmel's approach, and you could see it happening in real time if you knew what to look for. Perhaps sensing that the conversation was becoming too serious for his liking, too focused on the actual work rather than the celebrity gossip and cheap laughs that often dominate these shows, Kimmel decided to steer things in a completely different direction. Instead of building on Murphy's thoughtful responses, instead of asking follow-up questions that would have deepened the conversation and given viewers even more insight into the creative process, he began making light of the actor's intensity and dedication. What started as gentle ribbing quickly escalated into increasingly crude jokes about Murphy's preparation process, mocking the very professionalism and commitment that had made him one of the most respected actors of his generation. The audience, initially laughing along with what seemed like harmless banter, began to grow noticeably quieter as Kimmel's comments became more personal and less professional. You could hear the shift in their energy, the way their laughter became more forced and uncomfortable as they sensed that something wasn't quite right about the direction this conversation was taking. The crew members visible in the background began exchanging glances, clearly picking up on the tension that was building between host and guest. Even the band members, usually focused on their instruments and waiting for their next cue, were paying closer attention to what was happening at the interview desk. Murphy, to his enormous credit, initially tried to laugh along with Kimmel's increasingly inappropriate behavior, clearly attempting to be a good sport despite the host's obvious lack of professionalism. He deflected the first few jabs with grace and humor, even managing to turn some of Kimmel's weaker attempts at comedy back into genuine conversation about his work and the film industry. His responses showed the kind of class and professionalism that you'd expect from someone who had spent decades navigating the entertainment industry with dignity and tact. He tried to redirect the conversation back to substantive topics, attempted to answer the underlying questions that might have been buried beneath Kimmel's crude jokes, and generally did everything possible to salvage what was rapidly becoming an uncomfortable situation for everyone involved. But Jimmy Kimmel wasn't interested in letting the conversation return to a professional level. Instead of recognizing Murphy's attempts to keep things on track, instead of appreciating the actor's efforts to maintain some semblance of dignity and substance in their exchange, Kimmel doubled down on his inappropriate behavior. He began making increasingly personal comments about Murphy's appearance, mocking his accent in ways that bordered on offensive, making crude observations about his intensity and dedication that revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be a serious artist in any field. These weren't the gentle jabs between friends that sometimes characterize good-natured celebrity interviews. These were mean-spirited attacks on a guest who had done absolutely nothing to deserve such treatment. The turning point, the moment when this uncomfortable situation became something much worse, came when Kimmel made the decision to bring up Murphy's personal life in the most inappropriate way possible. Specifically, he began making jokes about Murphy's wife and children, crossing every conceivable line of decency and professionalism that should exist between them. These weren't clever observations or witty commentary. They were cruel, personal attacks on people who had nothing to do with the interview. The moment Kimmel's words about Murphy's family left his mouth, you could feel the entire atmosphere in that studio change, like someone had flipped a switch. The audience fell completely silent, not the kind of quiet that comes from rapt attention, but the uncomfortable silence of people who know they've just witnessed something they shouldn't have. Camera operators continued filming, but you could see some of them shifting uncomfortably behind their equipment, clearly aware that this interview had crossed into territory that no professional television appearance should ever enter. The production crew, visible in the background, stopped their usual bustling activity and turned their attention fully to what was happening at the interview desk, sensing that they might be witnessing something that would need to be dealt with immediately. Murphy's entire demeanor transformed in that instant, and if you watch the footage carefully, you can see the exact moment when his polite professional facade gave way to something much more real and much more dangerous. The smile that he'd been maintaining throughout Kimmel's increasingly inappropriate behavior simply vanished, wiped away as if it had never existed. His posture straightened, his shoulders squared, and for the first time since sitting down in that guest chair, he looked directly at Jimmy Kimmel with an expression that could have frozen hell itself. This wasn't the controlled intensity that Murphy brings to his most dramatic roles. This was genuine anger from a man who had just watched a line be crossed that should never, under any circumstances, be crossed in a professional setting. What happened next was a masterclass in controlled fury and professional dignity under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Murphy didn't raise his voice. He didn't lose his temper in the way that most people would have when faced with such outrageous behavior. He didn't resort to the kind of explosive outbursts that many would have considered completely justified under the circumstances. Instead, his response was so measured, so carefully controlled, and so absolutely devastating in its precision that it left Jimmy Kimmel visibly shaken, and the entire studio audience in stunned, complete silence. Murphy leaned forward slightly, in his chair, a movement so subtle that some viewers might have missed it, but one that conveyed more menace and authority than any dramatic gesture could have achieved. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but carried an unmistakable edge that cut through the studio atmosphere like a razor blade through silk. The Irish accent that he'd spent years learning to modulate for various roles became more pronounced, as it often did when he was experiencing genuine emotion, lending an additional weight and gravity to every word that came out of his mouth. "Jimmy," he said, and just the way he pronounced the host's name carried enough disapproval to make everyone in that studio understand that something significant was about to happen. "I came here tonight as a professional courtesy, to talk about work. That means something to me, work that a lot of talented people poured their hearts into creating. I didn't come here to be your punching bag for cheap laughs, and I certainly didn't come here to have my family, people who have nothing to do with this conversation, and everything to do with my private life, dragged into your sad, desperate attempt at what you apparently consider comedy." The silence in the studio was so complete that you could hear the hum of the air conditioning system, the soft whir of camera motors, and the barely audible breathing of audience members who seemed afraid to make any sound that might interrupt what was clearly becoming a defining moment in late-night television history. Jimmy Kimmel, clearly not expecting this level of pushback from someone he'd apparently assumed would just sit there and take whatever abuse he wanted to dish out, tried to laugh off Murphy's response, waving his hand dismissively in a gesture that somehow managed to be both condescending and pathetic at the same time. "Oh, come on, Cillian. It's all just jokes. We're just having fun here," Kimmel said, his voice carrying a nervous edge that betrayed his awareness that he'd pushed things too far, but his words revealing that he still didn't understand the magnitude of his error. "This is what we do on late-night television. We joke around. We have a good time. We don't take everything so seriously. Lighten up a little bit, will you? But Murphy wasn't having any of Kimmel's pathetic attempts to minimize what had just happened or to frame his cruel, unprofessional behavior as somehow normal or acceptable. His eyes never left Kimmel's face as he continued his response, his voice remaining controlled, but somehow becoming more powerful and more commanding with each word he spoke. You see, that's exactly the problem with people like you, Jimmy. You think because you have a platform, because you have an audience, because you're sitting behind that desk with cameras rolling and people watching, that gives you some kind of right to say whatever you want about whoever you want. You think other people's dignity, other people's families, other people's privacy and personal boundaries are all just raw material for your next cheap laugh and your next momentary spike in ratings. Kimmel, now visibly uncomfortable and clearly beginning to realize that he'd made a serious error in judgment, attempted to regain control of the situation by signaling to his production team that they should cut to a commercial break. It was a cowardly move, an attempt to escape the consequences of his own behavior by hiding behind the mechanics of television production. But Murphy, displaying the kind of commanding presence that had made him such a compelling screen presence for over 2 decades, held up his hand in a gesture so authoritative and so final that even the host fell silent, and the production team froze in place. "No," Murphy said, his voice cutting through Kimmel's stammered attempts to deflect and escape. "We're not cutting away. We're not going to commercial. We're not done here. You brought my family into this conversation. You made this personal, when it should have remained professional. So let's keep it personal for just another moment while I explain something to you that you clearly don't understand." The actor stood up slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate and measured, conveying a sense of purpose and determination that made it clear he wasn't going to be rushed or interrupted or talked over. The camera operators, unsure of what protocol demanded in such an unprecedented situation, kept their cameras rolling, capturing every second of what was rapidly becoming one of the most uncomfortable and riveting moments in the history of late-night television. Murphy looked down at Kimmel, who suddenly seemed very small and very vulnerable behind his desk, surrounded by all the trappings of his show but stripped of any real authority or dignity by his own unprofessional behavior. "You want to know what's really funny, Jimmy?" Murphy continued, his voice dripping with a contempt that was all the more devastating for being delivered so quietly and so calmly. "What's actually hilarious, what should have your audience rolling in the aisles, is watching someone who's built their entire career on making fun of other people, on punching down at anyone who gives them a target, completely fall apart the moment someone stands up to them and calls them on their behavior. You can dish it out, clearly you can dish it out all night long, but you obviously can't take even the slightest bit of pushback when someone refuses to play along with your little game of humiliation and disrespect." Murphy took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, not in a threatening or aggressive way, but with the measured confidence of someone who had found their moral footing and wasn't going to be moved from it by anything the host might say or do. His presence seemed to fill the entire studio space, commanding the attention of every person in that room, from the audience members who were hanging on his every word to the production crew who had stopped everything they were doing to witness this unprecedented confrontation between guest and host. You're sitting there behind your desk, in your safe little studio, surrounded by your staff and your security and your carefully controlled environment, thinking you're untouchable, Murphy continued, his Irish accent lending a musical quality to words that were nonetheless cutting deeply into whatever remained of Kimmel's professional composure. You think because you have this platform, because people tune in to watch your show, that somehow makes you important, that somehow gives you license to treat other human beings as nothing more than objects for your entertainment. But here's the thing about bullies, Jimmy, and that's exactly what you are. Nothing more and nothing less than a bully who happens to have a television show. Eventually, someone comes along who isn't intimidated by your little performance. Someone who calls you on your nonsense and makes you face the reality of what you actually are. The audience remained completely silent, but their silence had evolved from uncomfortable shock to something more like rapt attention. Many of them seemed genuinely engaged by witnessing someone finally stand up to a host who had clearly crossed too many lines. Not just tonight, but probably many times before, with guests who didn't have Murphy's combination of stature, eloquence, and moral certainty. Others appeared uncomfortable with the level of tension in the room, shifting in their seats and glancing around as if hoping someone would intervene and return things to the familiar territory of scripted banter and safe celebrity promotion. Jimmy Kimmel, meanwhile, was practically squirming in his chair, occasionally glancing toward his producers and directors off camera, as if pleading for anyone, to help him out of the hole he'd dug for himself. But no help was coming, because there was no script for this situation. No prepared response for a guest who refused to play along with the unspoken agreement that celebrities should accept whatever treatment hosts decide to dish out in exchange for the privilege of promoting their work on national television. Murphy's voice grew stronger and more passionate as he continued his devastating critique, but he never raised it to a shout, never lost the controlled intensity that made every word he spoke feel both measured and spontaneous. "I've been doing this for over 2 decades, Jimmy. I've sat through countless interviews with hosts all over the world. I've worked with hundreds of people in this industry, from the biggest stars to the hardest working crew members, and I've always tried to be professional, to be respectful, to treat everyone with the same basic courtesy and human dignity that I would want to be treated with myself. But respect, real respect, is a two-way street, and you, my friend, have shown me absolutely none of it tonight." Kimmel finally found his voice, stammering out what sounded like the beginning of an apology, claiming he didn't mean anything by his comments, that it was all just part of the show, just the way things worked in late-night television, just harmless fun that Murphy was taking too seriously. But his words came out jumbled and unconvincing, the desperate backpedaling of someone who had realized too late that he'd made a serious mistake but still didn't fully understand the depth of his error or the complete inappropriateness of his behavior. Murphy cut him off before he could finish his pathetic attempt at damage control, holding up his hand again in that same commanding gesture that had silenced the host earlier. "Don't," he said firmly, his voice carrying a finality that made it clear this wasn't a negotiation or a discussion, but a statement of fact that Kimmel needed to hear and understand. "Don't insult my intelligence, and don't insult the intelligence of everyone watching by pretending this was anything other than exactly what it was. You knew what you were doing, Jimmy. You made a conscious choice to be cruel, to be unprofessional, to use your position and your platform to try to humiliate someone who came here in good faith, who treated you with respect from the moment I walked onto this stage." The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, and everyone in the studio could feel the electricity in the air, the sense that they were witnessing something that would be talked about and analyzed for years to come. Murphy took another step toward Kimmel's desk, his body language conveying absolute moral authority, the confidence of someone who knew without question that he was on the right side of this conflict, and that everything he was saying needed to be said, not just for his own sake, but for every guest who had ever been mistreated by a host who confused cruelty with comedy. "You know what the real tragedy is here, Jimmy?" Murphy said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, which somehow made his words even more impactful, more devastating, more impossible to ignore or dismiss. "The real tragedy is that you had a chance tonight to have a genuine conversation with someone who spent their entire career trying to bring authentic stories to life. Stories that matter, stories that connect with people on a fundamental human level, stories that might actually mean something to the people watching at home. Instead, you chose to turn it into this circus, this pathetic display of everything that's wrong with celebrity culture and entertainment television today." Jimmy Kimmel, sweating visibly now, and clearly desperate to find some way out of this situation that wouldn't completely destroy what remained of his credibility, made one last attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of this interview. He stood up from behind his desk, trying to match Murphy's energy and presence, trying to reclaim some measure of control over his own show, and said something that would prove to be the final nail in the coffin of this already disastrous encounter. "Listen, Cillian," Kimmel said, his voice carrying a condescending tone that revealed he still didn't understand the gravity of the situation or the depth of his own unprofessional behavior. "Maybe you're just not cut out for American television. Maybe you should stick to those artsy little independent movies where nobody has to actually have fun or crack a smile once in a while. This is how we do things here. This is American entertainment. And if you can't handle a little joking around, maybe you should just go back to Ireland and make films that 3 people will see." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, so inappropriate and so offensive that even some of the audience members gasped audibly at the sheer audacity and ignorance of what their host had just said. The crew members visible in the background looked genuinely shocked by Kimmel's incredibly tone-deaf response, and you could see several of them shaking their heads or looking away in embarrassment at being associated, even tangentially, with such unprofessional behavior. Cillian Murphy stared at Jimmy Kimmel for a long, tense moment, and then something changed in his expression. A slight smile appeared at the corners of his mouth, but it wasn't a pleasant smile, wasn't the kind of expression that suggested amusement or forgiveness or any kind of reconciliation. It was the smile of someone who had just been handed the perfect ammunition to end this confrontation once and for all. The smile of someone who knew that his opponent had just made a mistake so profound and so revealing that no further argument would be necessary. "Not cut out for American television?" Murphy repeated slowly, letting each word hang in the air, his Irish accent now thick with controlled fury and absolute moral certainty. "Jimmy, I've been nominated for Emmy Awards for my work on American television. I've worked with some of the greatest directors and actors of my generation, many of them Americans who understand what professionalism and respect actually mean. I've been fortunate enough to be part of projects that have touched millions of people around the world, including right here in America, projects that have won awards and changed lives, and actually contributed something meaningful to the cultural conversation." Murphy began walking toward the edge of the stage, clearly indicating that this interview was over and that he was leaving, but he wasn't done speaking. The cameras followed him as he delivered what would become one of the most quoted and analyzed moments in late-night television history. Words that would be replayed on social media, discussed in entertainment journalism, and remembered long after this particular episode of the show had been forgotten. "But you're absolutely right about one thing, Jimmy," Murphy continued as he walked, his voice carrying clearly throughout the studio and to the millions of viewers watching at home. "I'm not cut out for this particular brand of American television. I'm not cut out for whatever this sad, desperate, mean-spirited garbage is that you're peddling here tonight. I'm not cut out for a version of entertainment that thinks cruelty is the same thing as comedy, that confuses bullying with banter, that treats human dignity as something to be sacrificed for cheap laughs and momentary ratings spikes." By now, producers and directors were frantically trying to figure out how to handle this unprecedented situation. The show was supposed to continue with musical guests and comedy segments and all the other elements that make up a typical late-night television program, but it was absolutely clear that this confrontation had completely derailed everything they had planned. Security personnel began moving closer to the stage area, though it was unclear whether they were there to protect Kimmel from any potential physical confrontation, to escort Murphy out of the building, or simply to maintain some semblance of order in a situation that had spiraled completely out of anyone's control. Kimmel, realizing that he had not only lost complete control of his own show, but had also been systematically dismantled by a guest who had revealed him to be nothing more than a small-minded bully with a television platform, made one final, desperate decision that would crystallize everything wrong with this entire encounter. Instead of apologizing, instead of acknowledging his mistakes, instead of showing even a shred of the professionalism that should characterize anyone in his position, He signaled to his security team, and, in front of the entire studio audience and television viewers across the country, had Cillian Murphy escorted off the set. It was a moment that perfectly encapsulated the complete moral bankruptcy of Kimmel's position. Here was a respected actor, someone who had maintained his dignity and professionalism throughout an encounter that would have justified much stronger responses, being physically removed from a television studio because a host couldn't handle being called out for his own inappropriate behavior. Murphy had done absolutely nothing wrong except defend his own dignity and his family's privacy, except refuse to be a willing participant in his own humiliation, except insist that basic human decency should apply even in the artificial world of late-night television. As security personnel approached, Murphy raised his hand slightly, showing that he had no intention of causing any physical disruption or making the situation any more uncomfortable for the audience than it already was. His dignity remained intact even in this final absurd moment, his bearing still conveying the kind of class and professionalism that had been completely absent from his host's behavior throughout the entire encounter. But Murphy's final words, to Jimmy Kimmel, delivered as he walked toward the exit with security escorts flanking him, were devastating in their simplicity and their absolute, undeniable truth. "This says everything anyone needs to know about who you really are, Jimmy," he said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the studio despite the chaos and confusion that surrounded him. "I hope it was worth it. I hope whatever you think you gained from this pathetic performance was worth showing the entire world exactly what kind of person you are when the cameras are rolling and people are watching." He then turned to the audience, the same people who had applauded his entrance and who had been forced to witness this uncomfortable confrontation, and delivered an apology that somehow managed to be gracious and dignified even in the midst of such an undignified situation. "I apologize that you had to witness this tonight," he said, his voice conveying genuine regret that their evening's entertainment had been ruined by their host's unprofessional behavior. "You came here expecting to be entertained, to maybe learn something interesting about filmmaking or storytelling, and instead you got this circus. You deserved better tonight, and frankly, so did I. So what do you think about all of this? Was Cillian Murphy completely justified in standing up for himself the way he did, refusing to play along with Jimmy Kimmel's cruel games, and insisting that basic human decency should apply even in the world of celebrity entertainment? Or should he have just smiled and laughed along and played the part that apparently so many guests are expected to play, accepting whatever treatment hosts decide to dish out in exchange for a few minutes of promotional time on national television? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe for more deep dives into the Hollywood moments that reveal the real character of the people involved. Let me know, when is it okay for a celebrity to draw the line and say, "Enough is enough"? And what does this confrontation tell us about the toxic culture that seems to exist behind the scenes of so much of our entertainment industry?